Hey, welcome everybody. We're going to be starting, well, let's start now. It's 8 o'clock in California and 11 o'clock on the East Coast and 5 o'clock in Rome. So let me welcome you to our first webinar in our new series of Building a Transparent and Accountable Church. Today we're going to be talking about organizing the church. How do we structure the government of the church? Is it a pyramid or a team? There's been a lot, I think there's a lot of conversation to be had around this. Father Bob did a great lecture for us back in February, which we have both on the Global Institute website, gicm.org, and on the Program of Church Management website. And Father Bob also gave a talk on this at the Notre Dame Fall Conference. Was it last year, Father Bob, or the year before?
It was the year before.
Year before. All right. So there's a lot to unpack. And I think we've seen with the different challenges that the church has faced that there's a lot of work still to be done. And I'm looking forward to today's conversation. Again, just to begin unpacking this. This is a work in progress. You know, the Holy Father, from the beginning of his pontificate, has been encouraging this type of work. He said that the church and also the Code of Canon Law gives us innumerable possibilities, much freedom to seek these things. And that I think is key, because we tend to think of the structure in the church as very top down, it's set in stone like the 10 Commandments. And instead there's actually, I think there's a lot of leeway here for a lot of creativity. And it might vary region to region and so forth. But I want to open the conversation up today. Let me tell you first how we're going to work. We're going to do basically 2 rounds of the panel. We'll start with Father Bob, and then we'll move on to Mary, and then John. Then we'll come back for essentially a second round. For those of you who are watching, we welcome your questions, and I would ask that you submit them at the bottom. There's a chat button where you can put the questions, and we'll be doing Q&A at the end of it. At the end of the webinar, we've been very intentional to make sure that will be time for Q&A, because I know that oftentimes that's really the most instructive time. So with that, let me introduce myself. I'm Pia de Solenni. I'm the President and Executive Director of the Global Institute of Church Management here in the United States. We work with the Program of Church Management in Rome, which is essentially our flagship program, to provide certificate programs and executive sessions in management for church leaders, both lay and clerical. Today we're joined by Father Bob Gahl, who is a professor in Rome, and he's also the vice chair of the Program of Church Management. John Hillen, who is I just had it in front of me, the CEO of Everwatch Solutions, and he's also the Wheat Professor of Leadership and Ethics at Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia. And then we have Mary Hallan FioRito, who is also a good friend of mine, going way back. Mary is the Cardinal Francis George Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and also at the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture at Notre Dame. I'm going to have each of the speakers, I've asked each of them to give a little bit more on their background when they begin their sections, just because I find that it's fun to hear about people's backgrounds from themselves. I could read you lots of pages, but I want to take advantage of our time and make the best use of it. So with that, I'll turn to Father Bob, and would like, Father Bob, welcome. Thank you for being with us. Would like to have you kind of outline some of the concrete implications of your ideas on the theology of management. You've spoken about this in the past. And again, for our viewers, that content is available at both the websites of Global Institute of Church Management and the Program of Church Management. But would like to turn the mic over to you, so to speak. So welcome, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Pia. Thanks so much for putting this together. And thanks, John and Mary, for being here. I really look forward to this conversation. And Pia, thanks for all that you're doing with the Global Institute of Church Management. Since we did the simulcast worldwide launch right at the end of June, on June 30th, with that message from Cardinal Pell, things have been moving quickly despite the difficulties that we've had with the pandemic, with COVID and so forth. So congratulations, Pia, for keeping things moving ahead in a way that's so important, because to serve the church and to bring about this renewal and this reform of the church, which is coming directly from the request from Pope Francis. And so many bishops are asking us to provide this formation, which entails really developing new curriculum oftentimes. And that's part of the purpose of this webinar, which is to reflect about how the church can look in a detailed, let's say even legal, financial, and management organizational way as we move forward. I mentioned that this is in accord with the specific request of Pope Francis. I had the blessing to meet with him personally as we were about to launch the program of church management in Rome. And he encouraged us, he said, avanti così, così avanti, to go ahead just as we were doing, to make it so that the church might really be a poor church for the poor. And of course, what this means is that not only do we serve the poor by offering help to those who are marginalized somehow, and when I say somehow, it's not just a kind of financial poverty, but also a poverty with respect to their formation in the principles of the faith, but that the church also be more effective in bringing about her mission of evangelization. Now, this is exactly the way Pope Francis began his pontificate, his Petrine ministry. And it's clear that it was for this very reason that the College of Cardinals elected Jorge Mario Bergoglio to lead the church as Bishop of Rome. He said that the church must be creative in seeking, this was right at the beginning of his Petrine ministry, so the church must be creative in seeking new ways. He said, that is, seeking how best to proclaim the gospel. And that the church and also the Code of Canon Law gives us, as Pia mentioned, innumerable possibilities, much freedom to seek these things. There's a recent document that one of our participants reminded me about that was published by the Congregation for the Clergy just at the end of June. It was signed by Pope Francis at the end of June. The date of it when it was released was in July 20th, and it's called The Pastoral Conversion of the Parish Community in Service of the Evangelizing Mission of the Church. Those are a lot of words, but pastoral conversion really means renewal, reform. It means transformation of the parish. And all of us know the parish. It's where most of us, I imagine, were baptized for many of us as infants. For many of us, it's the home of the church where we receive most of our formation. And for the program of church management and Global Institute of Church Management, the parish is the paradigm, really the locus of much of our attention, because if something for reform and renewal of the church is going to be effective, it will be effective at the parish level. So when we are considering Episcopal conferences, we're considering Catholic universities, schools, hospitals, diocesan organizations, it's really the parish that if we can transform the parish so that it is more effective, bring about renewal in the parish, that those same principles and many of the technical solutions will be applicable also in those other institutions of the church. It's for this reason that in the program of church management, the cases and the examples that we use really privilege the parish community. And at the same time, or I should say precisely for that reason, our students or participants have already found this to be really helpful. I'm thinking, for instance, of a man by the name of Eric, who's an administrator of a Catholic hospital in Pakistan, and he's a layman, and he has found this kind of exemplification of how we can renew the church to promote transparency and effective organizations to be very helpful in his work as the administrator of a Catholic hospital in Pakistan, where he's dealing with all kinds of challenges you can imagine with COVID and with the Catholics, Christians being such a slim minority in a really Muslim nation. So given this, in my inaugural lecture that I offered to the third cohort for the program of church management back in February of this year, which is entitled A Theological Framework for Church Management, I propose, in a sense, it's a simple idea, but it's for some it's revolutionary, and it's not my idea. It's an idea that is proposed by Vatican II, and it's an idea that really has been present since, of course, our Lord Jesus Christ came to found the church 2,000 years ago. And it's an idea that John Paul II has also enunciated, and we can find constantly in the teaching of Benedict XVI and in Pope Francis. And yet, unfortunately, many people misunderstand it, or they simply miss this idea and its importance. Even though it's been around for 2,000 years, it's in a sense, it's revolutionary. For many people, when we think about the church, we think about bishops, priests, the hierarchy, buildings, when what the church understands for itself is very different from that. The church is each of us, the baptized, it's especially the lay people. So it's really families are the church. And that doesn't mean they're church when they go to the church building, but that they're church when they're going about their family life, when they're in the workplace and so forth, when they're out in the world. Now, this is explicit teaching of the church. And therefore, what it entails is that the ordained ministers, who, like myself and those who have the fullness of the priesthood in with the episcopal ministry, that these ordained ministers, of course, exercise a special function of governance, but that function of governance is one of service, to the point that if you think of the hierarchy in the church like a pyramid, in a sense with the Pope on top, and you can think of the church, and we should think of the church as a very lean organization, because there are very few levels of administration and of management. It's really the Pope, bishops, and then what? Then it's like each of us, the lay faithful. So for many of us, if we could do the steps in order to reach the Pope, how many levels of managerial structure or of hierarchy? Depending on how you count, it's like 3, maybe 5 at the most. If you want to include the College of Cardinals or offices in the Holy See, it might be 6 or 7. And for an organization that has over 1 billion members, this is quite amazing. What I'm proposing is, if the hierarchical structure of the church is a pyramid like this, I'm proposing that we need to think of this pyramid as inverted, turned upside down, because each of us as baptized, so all of the lay faithful, are in fact charged directly by Jesus Christ, empowered, delegated, in order to have responsibility for the church. Now, this can be a revolutionary mindset, and again, it's Vatican II, it's John Paul II, and this should illuminate how we think about all church organizations, and especially the parish. So we consider the parish, and here my time has almost run out, but let me just make a quick suggestion regarding what could be the implications regarding this. And the implications are ones of transparency and cooperation of the lay faithful, whereby this doesn't supplant the role of the pastor, who is an ordained priest, and he is appointed by the bishop. This is, of course, in agreement with Catholic theology, and it's enunciated in law by canon law. And it's a way of safeguarding the ecclesial mission of the church, because the bishop, who's normally appointed by the Pope, and he appoints the pastor of the parish, and this secures the continuity with apostolic tradition and with Jesus himself. And yet there are different models by which the laity can participate in that governance of the parish. One way, which is already very much underway in many places, is through very active role of the parish council, the financial council of the parish. But there are ways of structuring this in a way that can be more effective. And it can also entail expanding in a creative way the incorporations that are recognized under civil law that support the parish and also support the parish financially in such a way that the laity who are professionals, can really take charge not of ecclesial goods, but take charge of some of those goods that the lay faithful want to contribute to various activities that are in support of the church, because it's always the bishop and the pastor of the parish who are directly responsible for ecclesial goods. But what I'm suggesting, and we should have more time to discuss this further on in this webinar, is that there are ways of structuring under both canon law and civil law, whereby, respecting the authority of the bishop and of the pastor of the parish, lay people can have a more active role of governance. And of course, this will lead to greater transparency. So I'll end my words there now, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great, thank you, Father Bob. I very much appreciate it, and it's a lot to pack into just a few minutes. Mary, I want to welcome you for our next contribution. You've had an extensive background in the church. Maybe you can share that with our viewers. I really look forward to hearing kind of what your perspective is on some of the challenges in church leadership. What works, what doesn't work. And for the record, I'm a fan of Mary's work. I wish that she would be hired by different chanceries to come in and put together a bishop's office. I just think that this is Mary's sweet spot, one of many actually. But Mary, let me turn it over to you. And again, thank you for being with us today.
Well, you're most welcome. I hope I can live up to that wonderful introduction, Pia. As Pia mentioned, we've been friends for many years. I am a civil lawyer by training, but for 28 years worked for the Archdiocese of Chicago in a variety of roles. I was the director of the Respect Life Office, which is otherwise known as the Office for Pro-Life Activities. I did that as a young lawyer for about 7 or 8 years. And then was asked by now Bishop Paprocki, but at the time Father Paprocki, to become the first female vice chancellor in the Archdiocese. And that was a position I held for a number of years until Cardinal George tapped me to run the day-to-day operations of the Office of the Archbishop in the Archdiocese of Chicago. So for those of you who might not be kind of familiar what an Archbishop's office would look like in a big metropolitan see like Chicago, we had 9 staff members, 2 part-time, 7 full-time, secretarial staff, 2 people in the scheduling office alone, other staff that served as master of ceremonies, and then I was the executive assistant to the Archbishop, which meant I kind of supervised the staff, except for the one ordained member of the staff who I did not supervise. That was Cardinal George's preference, and kept sort of the day-to-day operations going. At this point, this would have been more snail mail rather than email, but managing that flow of mail, helping with correspondence and speeches, that sort of thing. So it was a real challenge, but also a great gift. I wish I had walked around with a recorder more to take down some of the things that Cardinal George would say. But so he was a great person for collaborating with the laity, and had, I think, a great interest in seeing women hold positions of responsibility when they were qualified to do so. But one of the things he would frequently say to staff, to all of us, when he got together, all the employees, would you be doing your work any differently if Jesus Christ did not exist? And that was a great sort of starting point for our, thoughts in terms of how we were doing our jobs. And, I love what Father Bob had to say about the cooperation of the lay faithful. The majority of the people who worked at our pastoral center were lay people. But that also presents a challenge. And it presents a challenge because I think we're really starting, frighteningly enough, if the Pew study and some of the other recent surveys of people who call themselves practicing Catholics are to be believed, the majority of them would not have what 30 or 40 years ago would have been considered a 5th or 6th grade knowledge of Catholicism. And I wish I was exaggerating that, but I'm not. You can look at John Cavadini's article. He's the head of the theology department at Notre Dame, the best and the brightest of Catholic young people coming. And he wrote an article for Commonweal, of all places, a very sort of left of center religious publication, about how distressed he was at the lack of basic knowledge of the faith that his incoming freshmen had, including frightening tidbits like half of them couldn't name the 4 Gospels. And literally, they didn't know what the Immaculate Conception was. They couldn't define transubstantiation. I mean, real sort of basic pillars of our faith could not be articulated by Catholic college freshmen. And so I think we're dealing with, and again, I'm not laying blame at anyone's feet for this. The new Pew study showed that if Catholics who self-identify only went to CCD, or it's called different things in different places, but essentially it is the weekend or after school program for children who attend public schools. And that's about 90% of all Catholics in the United States. The children attend public schools, do not attend parochial schools. Of that, if they only went to CCD in the morning not in the morning, for grade school and for high school, on a Saturday morning for an hour, by the time they were 25, only 5% of those students in that cohort were actually practicing the Catholic faith. We lose 95% of those people. And, I have a dear friend who's a parish catechist, and she shares my frustration. She said, you try to educate 300 kids in this parish who go to public schools on the budget that I have with a staff who was all volunteers. They're not trained to teach theology. They're not trained to teach religion in any kind of formal way other than the little program that the parish puts them through. So this is sort of what we have left lay people to is really a tremendously suboptimal education. And so this, of course, we would hire, obviously, from this pool of laity. And, I would sometimes, I remember causing kind of a little bit of a stir I was out with some evangelical friends, and I mentioned my frustration. This was when I ran the pro-life office, that not all of my colleagues at the office were pro-life. Not all of them shared the church's teaching on this. And they looked at me as if I had 3 heads had just sprouted out of my shoulders or something. And they said, at their evangelical churches, they said, you have to sign a profession of faith before we hire you as a layperson. We would never allow someone who didn't fully share our convictions, both theologically and on moral issues, to work here. We just wouldn't do it. You would have to, have a recommendation from your pastor, et cetera, et cetera. So I think going back at a minimum to hiring for mission is really critical, but also to keep in mind, and this was something that Cardinal George would often say to us, the hierarchical structure of the church is not a human invention. It comes from Christ, and therefore I am not free as your bishop to change it. And you may want a more sort of lateral workforce base, or to be able to give input in a sort of way that would supersede my authority as the Archbishop, but that's not how Christ organized the church, and we're bound to that here. And also attempted to emphasize, and this was very helpful, I think, for a lot of our employees who worked in the more social service-based departments or agencies, peace and justice related, that the church is different from a humanitarian agency or from a social service agency. We are not the same, and we can't go into it with that same kind of, attitude or incentive behind our work. And it may have wonderful humanitarian properties to it, but that's not why it exists. So we exist for the church. And so it's just sort of being for 28 years where, the Catholic sausage was made, so to speak. It is, I think, really needing to be at this point, at least from my own observations over the years, I think hiring has to be, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, a little more mission oriented. And I'm not talking about having litmus tests, but just really, we shouldn't be hiring people for key positions who don't understand some of the basic tenets of the faith. Or alternatively, we have a good, significant, substantive orientation program for employees. And so that kind of takes away embarrassment from them. So, in case you went to CCD and you're maybe sick that Saturday, here's sort of what, this is what the Trinity is. And I don't mean that to be flippant. There are some people who literally wouldn't have had that working knowledge, and it's not their fault. They were poorly catechized. The church didn't do very much about it, on balance. And now we're seeing the fruits of that, unfortunately. So now that's kind of all of my negative. And I am getting close to running close to my time. So I'll save some of this for questions and answers. But you do generally tend to have people who, whether or not they know the faith, they apply to the church because they do want to be of service. They do want this to be a way that they give themselves as a gift to the church and to the office of the Archbishop and to his pastoral priorities and needs. So with that, I will turn it over to John, I believe, next, and I'll be anticipating your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mary. I hate to admit it, but I was one of those incoming freshmen that John Cavadini spoke of. So
I'm surprised to hear that, and now you're a moral theologian. That's marvelous.
Yeah, thanks. Well,
Matthew, Mark,
it's a question of, pardon?
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
That's right. No, that's anyway, that could be a long conversation for another day. But I think you really hit on some important ideas that in order to have this dynamic structure, we need people who have the right skill set. With this, I want to turn to John. John, thanks for your time today. I know that you're very busy. I would love to hear from you, kind of like, why should the church be participating in some of the contemporary ideas of management? What are some examples of the structures that the church could be using? And, as Mary pointed out, Christ organized the church. So why are we having this conversation now where we're saying, hey, let's talk about best practices in management and how to make things relative to the church? So with that, I'll welcome you, John. And if you could just give us a quick few seconds of your background. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Hello, everyone. And yeah, really glad you could join us today. So I'm John Hillen, as Pia mentioned. I'm the CEO of a mid-sized technology services company, and I've been the CEO of 4 or 5 other companies, both public and private. So I've had part of my career as a CEO, but I'm in the leadership business. I'm in the institutional leadership business. I've been an assistant secretary of state, running about 1/6 of the State Department. I've been an Army officer, and I've been involved with a lot of nonprofit institutions. So I come to this from the perspective of institutional leadership a little bit regardless of what sort of business the institution is in. At the end of the day, everything from IBM to a 3-person volunteer church choir has one trait in common, in that both organizations and everything in between are full of people working together, trying to accomplish something. And that dynamic of institutional leadership is where I specialize. In between companies, I taught for 5 years as a full-time faculty member in a business school, and I taught leadership and strategy. And so my remarks will stem a little bit from that experience. And a book that I co-wrote came out about 1.5 years ago. Legatus magazine called it A Guide to the Interior Life for a Catholic Business Leader, which I thought was nice. I wish I had thought of that when we were writing it. But it really does speak to this issue. I co-wrote it with another great Catholic leader named Mark Nevins, Dr. Mark Nevins, who's one of the leading American specialists on organizational development and executive development. And what we wrote about was the alignment or misalignment of institutional needs on the one hand and executive competencies and development on the other. And that as institutions grew in the complexity and the sophistication of their mission and the environment around them, the executives did not often grow along with the institution. So, to give you a small example, the skills of an executive working at the top in a small private company are dramatically different from the exact same title and the exact same role of that executive working in the same position in a large public company. The game has entirely changed. And we found that almost all institutions, public, private, governmental, and we have a lot of case studies in the book, make plans to grow or change. A tiny percentage of those same institutions deliberately and rigorously make plans to grow or change the competencies of their leaders, the executive competencies of the leaders, to go along with the growth of the institution. So when I bring it back to the church, and I was the founding chair of the International Business Leaders Advisory Council for the program on church management, and I serve on the board of the Global Institute of Church Management. So I've been involved in this for a bit. And I'm on my parish finance council, right? So from the Vatican through the parish finance council, I've had a chance to view a lot of the bits of the church. And in fact, several bishops hosted me on my book tour to talk about these sort of things. But I'm going to push harder and further on what Father Bob said when he laid down the theological foundations of more lay involvement in governance. And I think by governance, we mean all the facets of oversight, institutional leadership, and the management of day-to-day things within an institution. All those levels, from what we might call management through to strategic leadership through to board level oversight. And I start with a couple of presumptions. One is we have great executive talent at the institutional leadership level among our faithful lay Catholics. Great executive talent. Some of the people I've met at Napa Institute events and the like absolutely blow me away. The men and women who are committed to the church as lay leaders and the extraordinary range of talents they have, like Mary and Pia and so many others. And this great wide range of life experiences that they can bring to the table in the service of the church. So that's one presumption. The second presumption is that the executive development pathway for our clergy is centered, especially as beginning, almost entirely in becoming a great priest. I can't imagine changing that. I don't know why we want to change that. But when you look at it, when you pull back and you look at it from an executive development perspective, we train our priests very hard in the seminary and then in their early years to administer the sacraments, assume pastoral responsibilities, and many times not much else. And then there can be different pathways. They may go a scholarly pathway. They may go a teaching pathway, an administrative pathway. Most thankfully, as Father Bob said, with the parish being the nucleus of our church and our faith, most go into pastoral responsibilities at the parish level. We don't train them much in administration or management, and that's something our programs that we're involved with at the Global Institute of Church Management are helping to fix. And we work through it. Some pastors have terrific administrative instincts, some don't. But either way, we're taking a bit of, as an institution, we're sort of just taking our chances. It's a little bit of a leadership lottery in many ways for what we'll get outside of the contrasting, incredibly rigorous training we give our priests and our other religious in theology and philosophy and the administering of the sacraments church, something that cannot be replaced, and has to be fundamental. When you get up to the episcopal level and the diocesan level, it's a different institution. It's not just a super parish. It's not just a parish on steroids in terms of the institutional challenges that are present to it. It is in an environment in which, you know, a group of small business leaders on the parish finance council are not likely going to have the sophistication for the public relations world the diocese is in, for the strategic institution building world, for the world of looking down throughout the breadth of the clergy and the lay leaders all the way down to the seminaries and having executive development assessments and pathways for people. How do we pick who leads where in our diocese? That could be done in the way it's done now, or it could be done accounting for some of the incredible tools that much of the rest of the world has developed over years to align strengths and competencies with roles and responsibilities to make sure we have really good alignment of these things and help with development paths for people to gain even more competencies and things. So there's a way in which much of the rest of the world takes advantage of this huge set of activities that represent alignment between institutional needs and challenges for which demand particular leadership skills and competencies, and then the skills and competencies of the executives that could possibly be in those roles, right on up through governance. I became aware of this briefly when I co-chaired a study on ethics in the Navy when I was serving on the Navy's Policy Advisory Board, the US Navy. And one of the things we discovered is that if you were trained for 20 years as a naval aviator, you were really, really good at being a naval aviator. I mean, these men and women land, you know, jets on a rocking postage stamp in the middle of the ocean at night, among other things. It's extraordinary. But you're not trained necessarily for the greater issues of institutional leadership. So when you get 20 years into your career and all of a sudden your flying days are done, and now you're a leader for the whole Navy or a bigger part of it, you've got to figure out all these other executive competencies and skills and try to layer on quickly experiences in broader issues of institutional leadership, rather than just the smaller ones of your career path through naval aviation. So it's very similar with our priests. And on the other hand, we have this constellation of hundreds, if not thousands, of very experienced, dedicated lay leaders who know institutional governance from the board level, from the strategic institution level, and everything on down, that want to help and can help. I have proposed that they help in more than an advisory capacity. I have proposed a model for a diocese that would look a lot like having minority independent directors on a board, where the bishop is still in the chair and the clerics still have a veto over control. But it's not just civilian advisors or lay advisors. It is lay members who actively have governance responsibility, even as independent minority members. They don't get involved in theology. They don't get involved in the real affairs, the ecclesiastical affairs. But boy, are they sure there to help in this array of challenges that our church has had at the diocesan and above level, and just dealing with the welter of issues that can come out of from being an institution in a largely secular society. So for my part, just on the basis of getting more competencies and skills that were trained in an entirely different way and with an entirely different kind of life into the better service of our church, I'm for a much more aggressive and lay role that's oriented in a fiduciary kind of way, not just an advisory kind of way at multiple levels in our church. So I'll stop there, Pia, and wait for our discussion.
Thanks very much, John. I think you're setting us up for some really great conversation in what I would like to call our second round. And again, I want to invite our participants to be sure and submit questions. There's a Q&A tab in the bottom of the Zoom screen, sort of in the center to the right. So feel free to submit questions for the Q&A. In this next section, I think I'm going to ask each of the panelists to take about 5 minutes, again, allowing for time for Q&A. And Father Bob, would like you to turn to you first, especially touching on canon law. You and I have had numerous conversations about this, and people are so nervous about it. First of all, I think there's some pretty rigid thinking around the role of the bishop, and people don't understand that actually there's a whole lot of latitude. Canon law tells you it sets certain guidelines, but it doesn't necessarily say you can't do 20 different scenarios out here. So I was wondering if you could speak to that, because I think that's really important. And honestly, as I've read over some of the abuse cases and so forth, I often wonder, why does a bishop take on all of this responsibility, particularly when there are, as John has pointed out, and Mary has alluded to, there are a lot of qualified lay people who could take on much of this responsibility and would facilitate this climate of radical transparency that you and I have been talking about for some time. And as we all know, one of the things that checks power is transparency. So without changing the office of the bishop, Father Bob, I'm going to turn it over to you. How can we get creative, respecting canon law within canon law? What are some creative structures?
Sorry about that. I was muted for a moment. And now you should be able to hear me. Now, thank you, Pia, and thanks, John, for some very provocative suggestions, especially towards the end of your words. Some principles at the beginning and some provocative suggestions. And Mary, thank you for some of those challenging ideas. I think just to summarize some of the points, Mary, you mentioned the difficulty in incorporating full participation of the laity, given that much of the laity are lacking in formation in the Catholic faith. Of course, what we're speaking of here in terms of conversion, renewal, and reform requires across-the-board renewal of the church, also improvement of our education and our formation, which is primarily the task of parents. And this is of a piece of what I'm suggesting with respect to the inverted pyramid, the upside-down pyramid, which is not a violation of church doctrine. It's exactly the way Jesus founded the church. When Jesus founded the church and entrusted to St. Peter the primacy over the other apostles, and he established the sacrament of holy orders, he didn't say that you, James and John, you're in charge of determining what kind of HVAC unit is going to be put in the new parish center. Whereas that is obviously something that you would expect that lay professionals might be more expert in than someone who has had the kind of formation that people in our seminaries have had. And as you've been speaking, the three of you, we've been getting questions coming in with the Q&A. And I'd like to greet Jim Pattison, who sent in a fascinating question, which can help to drive our discussion ahead. In fact, it has to do with what kind of governance it really explicitly in detail can the laity participate in. And simply by having a role within a financial council of a parish in which their role is consultative and not deliberative, that is not technically speaking governance, indeed. It is a kind of sharing in the governance, but it's not really governance. And towards the end of John's words, he spoke about how we can develop modes, new modes, whereby such participation in boards as members. Perhaps there's a different kind of member as the ordained cleric have within that board that would have the governance role of an institution which is at once civilly recognized and is also recognized under canon law. And these things can be done, and they can be done in new ways that may not be ordinarily contemplated, at least not in the United States, but there are many different configurations certainly under civil law for the church across different countries. So let me give a very specific example, and it's just an example. There's many directions that this can go to. Really, there's so much that I think needs to be developed in this area. And again, Mary's point is crucial, that the most important thing is personnel. And the most important thing is also, who are going to be these directors? Who are going to be these members? Do they have, first of all, the lay competence in order to give not just good advice, but to be able to make decisions on behalf of the church or on behalf of church property, or perhaps on behalf of those goods that are not technically speaking church patrimony under canon law, but are being used nonetheless by church entities and for the purposes of evangelization. So we must deal with take into account, of course, their preparation, both professional and also in terms of their doctrine, their doctrinal formation, also the spiritual, that they really be committed personally to the church's mission of evangelization. That's a crucial component. One of the questions out there is whether or not a non-Catholic or a non-Christian should be hired for a position in a church institution. Of course, it depends on what position they might have, but certainly if they're going to be teaching religion in a Catholic school, it's crucial that they are committed in their heart, even with their prayer life, to the faith and to all of what the church teaches. So back to the specific proposal. I'm speaking in Texas. I happen to be in Dallas for family reasons. I'm usually based in Rome. I'm at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross, where I teach philosophy. I didn't mention this at the outset. But here in Texas, I just heard of there's different structures for dioceses and for parishes, and I've heard of a quite flourishing parish here where they are set up in such a way that they actually have two separate 501c3s, and this is not unusual in the United States. So there are two separate nonprofit, civilly recognized organizations for the parish. One of them is the owner of the land, the real estate of the parish, and the other one handles the operating expenses for the parish. This is a very interesting let's say, thought experiment, because this model is, however, is not at all what I'm suggesting, and yet it opens the door to what I'm suggesting, because the pastor of the parish is directly the sole member of both of these corporations, and the bishop is, along with the auxiliary, is trustee, such that it really is top down. I'd say it's, let's say, old school. It's pre-Vatican II kind of structure where the ordained ministers make the decisions. And yet that structure really opens the door to the possibility of, well, why not structure a parish such that there be a 501c3, a nonprofit corporation, which as John was suggesting, the pastor can have a membership role in this corporation, but there can also be lay members, such that it has a kind of independence from the hierarchy, such that it is not a top-down determination from the hierarchy what new HVAC system is going to be put into the parish for the next year, how they're going to implement a new COVID sanitation effort in the new HVAC system, which is an idea that I think could be very interesting. You put in filters or UV lights in order to sanitize the air that's being pumped into the church building in order to secure a safe place for worship. Now, that isn't the expertise of those who have the sacrament of holy orders. So why not create a corporation under civil law that is not strictly speaking church patrimony, and yet receives donations on the part of the faithful who want to contribute to it, and therefore there is respect of the donor's intent, which is always the crucial thing in canon law. What canon law is seeking to do when it speaks of the special category of ecclesial patrimony, there are special rules regarding ecclesial patrimony, is to guarantee that those who donate to the church, that their donation is going to be protected with respect to its intent by the church itself, who is represented by the ordained minister, by the hierarchy. In contrast, though, if there is created a nonprofit which is perfectly legitimate, a nonprofit which supports the church, but whose patrimony is not part of the church, but the mission identity is protected because the pastor is on the board, this can be a wonderful way to assist the pastor to free him up from some of these technical decisions so that he can be personally more committed to the celebration of the sacraments, to guaranteeing that the liturgy and the formation and the spiritual accompaniment, which is really his proper role according to his ordination, is accomplished. Now, of course, he would continue to have a role on in this new corporation in order to secure throughout time the mission identity. And I think it ought not to be the pastor by name, but by office, such that whoever that pastor will be appointed by the bishop, will continue to secure the mission identity of this new nonprofit, which I'm suggesting can be, the decisions would be made principally by laity along with the cooperation of their pastor. We can think of similar such arrangements at the diocesan level, but I think I've spoken enough. Let's continue the conversation.
Thank you, Father Bob. I think you've set it up quite well for John. John, would love to have you just again reflect on the practical implications here, in perhaps the example that Father Bob's talking about, or if you want to bring in some other examples. And also, you know, we hear the language of the corporate veil. Why is the corporate veil important, and how do we maintain that? So, you know, I've given you enough to discuss in an hour and a half, and you get 5 minutes.
Sure, and I appreciate it. And I'll also try to answer some of these questions. I see a great question here from Father Dolan, General Dolan, retired Army chaplain in the Archdiocese of Louisville, Kentucky. Very, very pleased to see. Well, on the corporate veil, so the corporate veil, some of you may know and some of you may not, and Mary's probably much more of an expert on this being a lawyer, is in general principle. It's not in every country's law or legal tradition, by the way. Some version of it is in most mature legal codes and systems, but it basically protects the institution, the corporation, in its separate personhood. You might remember Mitt Romney was correct on this and his opponent incorrect how to interpret this in the law in a political debate some years ago. And so the corporate veil protects the corporation or nonprofit institution from the people being involved in running and leading it from being held to personal account, personal liability for the action institution, unless there's a number of things. That's called piercing the corporate veil. Dramatic personal crime and malfeasance and a bunch of other things. But it's a very important notion, and it allows for corporations and nonprofits to be separate institutions, the people running them to do the right thing for their institutions, be it company or nonprofit, and not have to worry about their own liability if they run crosswise with somebody, especially in this litigious society. So I think that can all be done, and I think that can all be folded into where Father Bob is leading us. There's a couple of questions just about the model and who does what in a different model, and that's exactly the conversation. If I put the people who ask these questions and a bunch of people with expertise in a big room full of whiteboards and butcher boards, we said in 5 days, we're just going to hammer out 6, 4, 2, 3 models on different kinds of governance and management models at different levels in the church, with our only principles being it's got to be a little bit different than we do things today, and it's got to be absolutely 1,000,000% in line with the real mission of the church, which is to save souls. And it's not going to threaten or undermine in any way our clergy on performing their sacramental and their ecclesiastical and their theological responsibilities, among other things. But other than that, ladies and gentlemen, we're in the room as a think tank. Everything's on the table. And you could just roll out all these different things. What are the kind of things that come up in your parish? What are the kind of things that come up in your diocese? What are the things that kind of come up in your archdiocese, in your life as a prince of the church for cardinals who are doing certain things? Who's attending to them? How are decisions made? What sort of reports are feeding people? What does the battle rhythm look like for how often you meet? Who talks through things? Who's, to quote a great line from the movie Hamilton, who's in the room where it happens? You know, when these decisions get made, all those things are great institutional conversations that can be had. and sorted. And we can't be afraid of that. I remember when I first wrote up some pieces of this provocation of mine in the national magazine, and it went out, I got a note from a very learned Catholic leader friend who said, "Are you suggesting that we elect our bishops like Lutherans, that lay elect our bishops?" I said, "No, because I would have said that if I was suggesting that." There's nothing of the sort. I think you can take all the traditional roles and responsibilities and accountability of the clergy and simply supplement it. And not just for the lawnmower or HVAC decisions, as important as those are at the parish level, but you can supplement it with real expertise and everything. I think it serves a broader purpose, which is I'm not entitled to speak for, but as I look across the scope of strategic challenges to our church, which I thought Mary just shrewdly outlined for all of us, we've got to do something. We've got to find a way to pull more lay energy and more lay leaders into this church to supercharge vocations and to, kind of re-energize where the church is in the face of just, today's variant of modernism. It's an age-old challenge for the church and one we should want to face. But I think bringing in lay leaders, making them feel more invested rather than just asking for their services, volunteers, it's necessary, but I get a kick out of the end of the masses in my parish where we have a bunch of, sort of multi-million-dollar CEOs all being asked only to help wipe down pews because the pews need to be wiped down. I think that's a great service and a service of humility that everybody should perform no matter what their station in life. But underneath all these people, there's a lot of talent. There's a lot of talent that can go beyond wiping down pews. And I'm not sure we ever really think about how to take advantage of it in the service of the church.
Thank you, John. Mary, if I can turn to you, if we were to implement some of these ideas, what would the chancery look like? I think first of all, and I'm seeing this too coming through the questions that are being submitted online, but it seems like both on the side terms of the lay and the clergy and within the clergy, the hierarchy, there kind of needs to be a little bit of paradigm shifting. And so what does it look like if we start making these changes? And what are some of the challenges that we face? And also, let me add one more to that, particularly as a lay woman, and you've managed a bishop's office, what does it take to bring qualified lay people in, including salary?
Okay, well, thank you. I'll take your first question first. As I mentioned at the outset, I'm from Chicago, and we had, for our longest serving mayor was Old Mayor Daley, as he's called, because his son went on years later to also be the mayor. I'm talking about Richard J. Daley. Had a great saying that's often quoted, in articles about him, and it had to do with someone who came to visit him at his office one day to speak to him about a job on his staff. And he asked his secretary who sent him. And his secretary said, "I don't think that anybody sent him." And his response reportedly was, "I don't want to talk to nobody that nobody sent." Meaning he wasn't sent by an alderman. He wasn't a friend of a friend. This isn't a payback for a favor. I don't want to talk to nobody that nobody sent. And I sort of use that in my own philosophy of hiring the Cardinal staff, which I was responsible for, with the exception of members of the clergy. I made sure, because of the very sensitive and private nature of some of the material that our secretaries see, that I had a letter from, or personal assurances from each person's pastor that they were Catholics in good standing and that they were practicing, which I could do legally on my staff because it really was sort of a combination of a practical role alongside a ministerial role. And this is where I think, if you don't think these kinds of things have real world implications, you need only to look to one of the Supreme Court's most recent decisions just about 6 weeks ago in the Our Lady of Guadalupe case, where you had two teachers, this is a consolidated case in the fact pattern, two teachers at the elementary school level who claimed they were not ministers and were attempting to sue the church for back pay and other benefits because they were both terminated from their positions. The church generally is considered what's called an at-will employer, which means you don't have to have a reason for being terminated in a ministerial role. And in a case several years ago, Hosanna Tabor, the Supreme Court unanimously decided that the state, the government, has no role in telling churches who its ministers are and who they aren't. That is something that's part of internal church governance. The courts and the government and the state need to stay far away from those conversations. It's not within the purview of those bodies to dictate to a church who its ministers are and aren't. But the employees, I mean, this is when you're reading through, the descriptions and even in the media, the employees, I mean, with a straight face, were saying, well, all I did was teach the kids prayers and take them to mass and help them get ready to have their confessions heard. And I mean, we're kind of contorting themselves into pretzels to say that they really weren't about any of this Catholic business. And in fact, one of the women who was deceased before the case made it to up to the Supreme Court level, her husband said, she just taught prayers from a book. She didn't really have anything to do with these kids' faith formation. And if that does not scream giant problem, to people who do hiring, it should on the Catholic level. I mean, at a minimum, we need to make sure that we're going to be hiring people who have the church's best interests as part of their heart and as a part of the way that they work as employees. Because down the line, if it goes south, it can have implications that are very serious legally and financially. So, I think it should be, again, made clear to people. And, our teachers, I think in some dioceses now, it's not unusual for an agreement to be signed between the school and the teacher, that a certain way of living as Catholics is expected to them. This is not to get into people's private lives, et cetera, but their public proclamations. I mean, I know of one situation, which I won't name, where we had a Catholic school teacher who was volunteering at Planned Parenthood on the weekends and didn't seem to think that this was a problem. And she said, well, I don't do abortions. That's not what my volunteer role is. The bishop's response was, I don't care if you're there teaching knitting. You cannot volunteer at Planned Parenthood and be a public minister in the church. And her retort was, I'm not a public minister. I just teach. I just read religion things from a book. So again, I don't mean to overly dramatize this, but there are, and these are just the things I know about. I think there are probably numerous other situations where you have people who perhaps agree with, they're attracted to some of our social justice teaching. They want to be in a place that would give them the opportunity to do that full time. Yet they're really not on board for the whole package, and that can be problematic down the line. So, second, how do you attract and maintain employees who both share the faith and who have the competence that John spoke about, the professional gifts that would really assist the church in her ministry. I was, I have to say, quite touched. I was actually personally recruited by Cardinal Bernardine right out of law school to run the Respect Life office. But Pia, as you mentioned, the salary issue is a significant one for lay employees in particular. And I had, about $40,000 in law school loans I had to repay. And the salary that I was offered barely gave me enough to make my monthly law school payments and to pay my rent. Chicago's not an inexpensive city. So, and it was a very public role. So I had to have appropriate clothing, et cetera, et cetera. It involves media quite a bit. So, when I was trying to negotiate for a salary that would have been more of a living wage for someone in my position, I was told that I needed to consider how much the Catholic school teachers made. And I thought, well, that's fine, but they get the summers off and I don't. And, there's give and take with every job, right? So at the end of the day, when I prayed about it, I really felt like God was calling me to do this job. But the salary issue was an issue. And I think it continues to be. We didn't have paid maternity leave, for example. And so when I had my children now, I had managed to accumulate after 28 years, a large number of sick days, which I used. And one of my daughters was prematurely born, so I had to use every one of those. But a maternity or paternity policy that reflected our pro-life values would probably be a help. And I know that there's a lot of financial concerns that come with those kinds of generous, family-friendly policies. But if we as a church aren't modeling them, I think we run into questions, legitimate ones from employees about our authenticity when we speak about those issues. So I hope that answers your question. Did I miss something, Pia, in the response there?
No, I think we're good. I want to look at some of these other questions here. I mean, in terms of compensation as well, one of the things that I like to remind people when they're looking at hiring lay employees is I constantly hear we don't have the money. And my first question is, tell me what the hourly rate is of your legal counsel.
Right.
And that really starts to put things into perspective. We have to, the money is there. There's some budgeting that has to be done, but this is where, again, maybe some lay expertise could come into play to help budget and meet these needs, both in terms of planning and in terms of fundraising. So we've had several questions, we've had several questions like, okay, great, we have a finance council, but it's purely advisory. How do we address the situation of a well-intended, excuse me, I'm reading a different question. Sorry, given that almost all the councils are consultative, how do we convince the bishops that it's good to make the decisions according to the proposals of specialists? So who would like to take that one up? I mean, again, I think this falls under the realm of canon law actually offers a lot of latitude here, but if one of you could take this up, I'd be grateful.
Pia, I'd be real happy to, I'm sorry, I hope I'm not interrupting, but just to interject a consideration that might clarify there's a lot of questions that are really deep and complicated. And just to clarify my proposal, which I think should help somewhat regarding these questions, which is we can think of Catholic theology and of canon law and the variety, the spectrum of solutions that we should be studying, that John said we should be writing up on a whiteboard, from the perspective of a real gamma that's left and right, if you will. And if you will, on the left, we can have an old-fashioned model, which is an old-fashioned pyramid in which the bishop tells us what to do, and the bishop is in charge of what school you go to, which is, of course, an improper model. It was never theologically correct. Parents have always been responsible for the education of their children. And let's say on the right, we could have the model, which we could call it congregationalist, whereby the people elect who their pastor is going to be. So it's really the laity, the baptized, determine everything, and you've eliminated the hierarchy. You could have a vote to determine what dogma is going to be. And of course, that is not the Catholic model either. The solution is somewhere in between. And that solution in between, there's so many varieties of models that can be joined together with Catholic theology. They're perfectly respectful of the ordained ministry. And one of them is to give the ordained minister veto power within a governing board of the institution with respect to those issues that are specifically his competence, and let the laity even make most of the decisions regarding pretty much everything else, even present to him the solution. And then he would have the veto power in order to guarantee the Catholic faith. I suggested this separation between corporations such that the property of the church building would be an ecclesiastical good as a way to guarantee that the bishop has the authority to appoint the pastor, which is required under canon law. And there's been some bad experiences in the US where in the Catholic Church, there were some parishes that were owned and run really by the laity, and then ended up, there's a case, a paradigmatic case in St. Louis, where when Cardinal Burke was the archbishop there, he ended up threatening excommunication of the laity there because they weren't accepting the pastor whom he was appointing. And they actually, under civil law, owned the church building. Now that's a risky solution that you want to avoid. That would be towards the congregationalist extreme that I mentioned, would be, let's say, on the right. Whereas if you separate out these two corporations, whereby the ones that are doing the ordinary maintenance of the parish is a separate organization that's not directly church patrimony, that is actually being run by professional laity who are fully committed to the Catholic faith and well-formed spiritually and doctrinally, but also professionally as experts in the civil realm. I think that's where we can begin to see solutions on the local parish level. We can imagine things also on the diocesan level. There are structures that already exist with respect to Catholic foundations or other foundations that don't have Catholic in the name that can take care of ecclesial goods or goods that are no longer ecclesial, but are respecting the desire of the donors, which can allow a lot of flexibility. And here I'm not saying do this simply because it's more efficient, because it's useful, because it's a way to protect funds from potential litigation by means of this corporate veil. But I say develop these new structures because it's the right thing to do. It's the principled thing to do, because according to the theology of Vatican II, the church is not simply the bishop, but the church is primarily, it is the mystical body of Christ, which is the bishop is serving the lay faithful, who should be the ones who are making actually most of these decisions.
Thank you, Father Bob. There's a question here that I'd like, that is provocative. How do we get bishops and priests to lead with the truth? And I think I want to nuance this a little bit, which is we are talking about kind of a paradigm shift, and instead of top down, we're talking about this pyramid model and so forth. How do we introduce this paradigm shift? I mean, my first answer is, as the head of Global Institute of Church Management, working with Program of Church Management, is I invite the members of the hierarchy and the clergy to attend our executive sessions with PCM. We hope to be partnering with local groups or local institutions in the United States to offer this training as well. But let me turn this over to our panelists. I mean, we are talking about a paradigm shift. I recently saw an article in a major newspaper where a woman, a board member, just said, well, he's the bishop, he gets to do what he wants. And I choked. So let me turn that over to our panel, whoever's comfortable taking that up. I don't know, John, you want to jump in, or Mary, whoever?
I'll say a quick word. I think we probably all got something to say on this. And I'll also just, second Father Bob's last intervention, which was I thought was terrific, and a terrific set of thoughts. On implementing it, there's a lot of groups that are interested in general in better administration, better management, better governance within the church at every level. A lot of apostolates, groups, and organizations. And for our part at the Global Institute of Church Management, we're mobilizing and aligning ourselves with a lot of these different groups, so that we have this combined effect on improving the church in this regard. But I do this exercise with corporate offsites, team building type exercises. And sometimes I just base the team building exercises around the Patrick Lencioni book, great lay leader, Patrick Lencioni. He's written a book for pastors, but I base the exercise on his famous book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And if you asked if most of our institutional arrangements in the church, you grabbed a diocese and threw them into that retreat and said, let's talk about you as a team, lay leaders, clerical leaders, others, or any other thing, we probably look pretty dysfunctional, purely from the standpoint of working together as a team, right? Just from that standpoint alone. And the nice thing about working out of dysfunctionality is there's no one answer. You can do what's right for the institution, right for the unique, in our case, 2,000-year-old set of circumstances, right for the mission, right for the contemporary settings in which we have certain challenges, and right for the people in the room. And so when I'm working with teams and building up from whatever we've identified as our dysfunctionality, at the end, we often sign what we call team charter. And the team charter would lay down exactly how we'd operate, who's doing what, who's got what responsibilities, how we solve conflicts, how often we come together and judge how we're doing as a team, how we measure institutional progress vis-a-vis team members and other things. So this is just a standard way that companies, nonprofits, even sometimes big families work through issues of this essential dilemma of people working together, right? People working together on behalf of an institution and sorting that out. We don't go through that. We sort of just, at almost every level, we sort of just fold into whatever kind of team we are, or whatever the preference is of the pastor or bishop. And I think if you did things like that, you get a very different set of answers. And some of the answers to some of the questions here might come out of what sort of charter that team adopted for how it was going to operate in order to accomplish the mission of the institution it was working for. So I think that kind of model, prompted by any of these institutions for interested in church management, to go out to clients, say it's a diocese, say it's a group of pastors, say it's a group of pastors and lay leaders, and just start working through that like you would in a corporate or organizational offsite. May not provide all the right answers, but the conversation certainly is not going to make things worse.
If I might add to that, Pia, first of all, John, when you said the habits of a dysfunctional team, I thought you said teen, and I have 2 teenagers. So I was thinking, gosh, that's a book I have to get. And then I realized you were saying team. So I was listening with a different set of ears for the first part of your remarks there. But, you know, Pia, you had said to me, I think one of the questions I didn't get to was, what would a diocesan structure look like if we followed some of, you know, my rules for hiring? And I used to have a kind of a joke with one of my coworkers, and I would say, for 5 years, I'm going to hire people only from these particular universities, people who are in a lay ecclesial movement, or people who come personally recommended by a pastor. And I want to look at 2 things: their commitment to the church and their competence on the same level. And I think we would have a very, very sort of different set of, you know, not only the work product, I think, would look different, frankly, but I also think that the day-to-day sort of, as you mentioned, John, the team dysfunctionality, some of that would go away as well. I mean, I can tell you about staff meetings I sat in where I was, you know, I mean, not to tell tales outside of school, but I was told, you know, by a fellow worker, I'm really uncomfortable with this church teaching on contraception. And I think in this, whatever presentation we were making, we just shouldn't talk about it. And I said, well, why can't we talk about it? It's a church teaching. We're all supposed to be following this, right? And I got pushback. I mean, significant pushback from a couple of my coworkers. So here we have a teaching that's sort of difficult to explain anyway in a secular culture. And it's even more difficult to explain when we have, you know, fellow coworkers who are supposed to be helping people accept the teaching and really understanding it as it being a benefit to marriages, and particularly a benefit to women's health. And, you know, you can't even get out of the gate to explain these teachings. And then we wonder why we have a laity that doesn't accept or follow or even understand what the church teaches and why. So I think when, you know, we're talking about building up a team, whether it's in a bishop's office or whether it is in, you know, a church's outreach to family and laity and education, that we really do have to be very critical. And, you know, I hate the word judgmental because it's so overused and misused. But I think we do have to make prudential human judgments on how a particular hire is going to impact, I mean, in some cases, thousands of people. You know, I think you see this. I mean, here's another ministry that we rely largely on volunteers, and it shows, is our pre-Cana programs. I mean, for the most part, they're abysmal. They're terrible. And, you know, and anybody who goes to them will tell you that you might get some good, you know, information on how to manage a checkbook and track family finances. But in terms of the moral substance of marriage and, you know, what permanence means and what, you know, not contracepting in your marriage means and why it's important, I think the majority, if I understand the statistics and the Pew study correctly, even the majority of our people teaching those classes don't follow the teaching. And I think, you know, we see the Catholic divorce rates almost as high as it is in the secular society. And then, you know, we can't say, oh, gee, how did that happen? So.
Thank you, Mary. Couldn't agree with you more. I just want to underscore too, in terms of hiring Catholics, I think it's important to try and hire Catholics. Well, I was the chancellor of the Diocese of Orange and theological advisor to the bishop before I took this role. And one of the things that I saw that really impressed me was, we say, well, there's a general thinking that, well, people need good formation if they're in these leadership roles. Well, I would say we need the good formation throughout the organization. And so in the Diocese of Orange, we did have things like, different days of recollection for Lent, for Advent, and so forth. And we were looking to do more. Again, none of us is perfectly formed. So there's this element of ongoing formation, I think, needs to be part of every Catholic institution. And then I would say too, I was really moved by people who were maybe working in maintenance or janitorial services who were Catholic, who had a very vibrant and committed faith. And it was beautiful just to see them taking a break in the middle of the day to stop and visit the Blessed Sacrament, and to understand that we're all in this work together. So I really would encourage hiring for mission at all levels, and not thinking, well, that's just a secretarial position, that's just maintenance. This is the whole work is mission. And I think that it's important to hire people that are mission minded at every level. So with that, I'm going to take the last word because we're at an hour and 15 minutes. So I want to be respectful of people's time. I want to thank you all for joining us, and especially our panelists. Thank you very much. I know that you're all extremely busy. We will be posting the video to this, and we'll be sending it out to all the participants. I'm also going to try and answer some of the questions that we didn't get answered, and then a few articles were mentioned, including John's article, and so we'll provide those links so that you have them. We are looking forward to being in touch with all of you as we grow Global Institute of Church Management and as we grow Program of Church Management, and we're grateful for your time and your expertise. So thank you very much. And again, this is just the first in a series of webinars for the academic year. The theme is building a transparent and accountable church. And so we'll be announcing the next webinar, the next few months, within a week or so. We just need to confirm the dates, but they will be monthly webinars. So we look forward to having you join with us. And again, one of the best things that you can do to help us is to share on social media, forward the emails, encourage other people to participate. And as always, your feedback is welcome. So thanks again, and God bless you, everyone.